the Berlin Wall was perhaps the symbol of Soviet oppression in Eastern Europe, or in Europe, because that's Central Europe. And because we all know the history of the wall, it was put up to prevent East Germans from fleeing a communist system for the West. And the taking apart of the wall was very symbolic of the end of the Cold War and the demise of the Soviet system. Now, obviously, that end only came a couple of years later, plus later, but still, this was a key event. And in terms of symbolism, this was the event. I mean, at the time, I was on the old Soviet desk at the State Department in charge of the office dealing with Soviet economics. And so, you know, we were all engrossed by this. I mean, I was in the department, I believe, and it was on television, so we saw signs of what was going on, and it was just extraordinary. Well, certainly the relationship was going to improve because the Soviet Union was the principal foe of the United States and of the West in general. I know there were a lot of people who were extremely optimistic about a new golden age setting in. I expected things to get better, but I was never confident that we'd establish this nirvana because there were geopolitical tendencies in Russian history which I thought would reassert themselves. And unfortunately, that's what's happened. I think the principal reason today why there's a difficult relationship between the West and Russia is that President Putin is pursuing an aggressive foreign policy. You know, there's a term of art in international affairs, revisionism, and that refers to policies designed to subvert the current order. And Putin is very much revisionist. And he doesn't like the settlement that was achieved at the end of the Cold War, a settlement which was ratified. Well, first it was ratified before the Cold War ended in the Helsinki documents in the 70s, but then the Paris Charter in the early 1990s, and Russia, of course, signed both of these documents. And they established an order based upon sovereignty of nations, the need to resolve disputes by either negotiations or by law, not by military conquest, the right of each nation to its territory and to its own policies, in other words, its sovereignty. And sadly, Mr. Putin's policies violate all these norms. Relations have gotten worse between the West and Russia as the West realized what Putin was doing and took steps, proper steps, to defend themselves and to help defend the countries which are under Kremlin assault. That means especially Ukraine, but also Georgia, as they defend themselves against that assault. 1989 was a great moment where we saw concretely in time on television, for those of us who are there, for those who were lucky enough to be in Berlin, how peoples of Eastern Europe who were under a Soviet yoke, an authoritarian, if not a totalitarian yoke, wanted freedom. And that was a bracing moment, and we should remember it, especially now as we see a certain swagger among authoritarians. I mean, not just Mr. Putin in Russia, but Xi in China, and then the mini-me's like Erdogan in Turkey, and Orban in a democratic society but behaving like an authoritarian in Hungary. And I know some folks are disheartened right now by the movement of these authoritarians. So they're having their moment, but their moment will pass, and soon enough. But it will pass sooner if our policies are both smart and, where appropriate, tough. Any vibrant democracy needs an active civil society. And of course, the United States has an active civil society going back to our pre-independence period. What we've seen in the post-Soviet space, a few countries have a vibrant civil society. I mean, that's true of Ukraine. That's true of Georgia. I think it's also true of Moldova. Many of the other countries, not so much. An educated citizenry is essential for an open society. And civil society is a major, if not the major component in providing that sort of education. So the work that we do, my center on Eurasia, is often in combination with civil society because, again, they're our natural partners. I mean, I was 28 years old when Reagan was elected, and it was clear a couple of years into his term that the United States was winning the Cold War. I mean, I think you can make the case it was clear earlier than that. But you had that very strange period when Nixon did détente with the Soviets, where the thought was that among some, perhaps even his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, that Russia was a rising power and the U.S. was a declining power. I never really bought that in the 70s, but it was clear to me by the early 80s that was wrong. So I can't say I had this dread about nuclear war. Obviously, a nuclear war would be a catastrophe for the entire world, and especially for the combatants. But I kind of felt that we had a pretty reasonable policy designed to protect our interests against the still aggressive Soviet Union without provoking an escalatory process which would lead to a nuclear exchange. So I'm not going to tell you that I said, I'm glad I have that nuclear burden off my back, because in fact, in the post-Soviet period, there was a more likely nuclear disaster in prospect, which was the old issue of loose nukes. As the Soviet Union fell apart, it lost control of its iron grip on, among other things, nuclear materials and other materials for weapons of mass destruction. And so the notion that some of those materials could have wound up in the hands of very nasty and completely irresponsible actors was a real one. But having said all that, the coming down of the Berlin Wall was a great day in human history, and it was a great day precisely because it was a vindication of the policies we pursued advancing freedom. This is a good thing to celebrate, a good thing to reflect upon, and also something which provides motivation, inspiration for us to pursue the right policies even when they're somewhat difficult right now.